Hello, welcome back to my channel. If you are new to my channel, my name is AbsolutelySha, and I am so glad that you decided to stop by my channel. So, I typically have done haul videos, I've done unboxings, but today I want to come to you with a different kind of video. And if you're into what I'm about to say, then you are going to love this video. So, excuse me. I don't know if I mentioned this in my get to know me video that I've done a while back, a couple of months ago, but one thing about me is that I really love true crime, like documentaries. I love television series. I love mysteries. Like, that is my thing. I am like a true crime addict. I am literally a part of Facebook groups of other true crime addicts. So like, I thought it would be fun if I share with you guys a true crime mystery. Like, still to this day, I believe that this murder has not been solved, and it's so good. So, if you are into true crime mysteries, you like that kind of stuff, then if you are not a subscriber of mine, I suggest you go ahead right now, like this video, subscribe to my channel, and then when I'm done, leave a comment for me about what you think about this story, because I definitely want to talk about this because I think it's such a really good, like, whodunit. So, if you are ready to get into the story, then stick around because I got a really good one for you. All right, so I am so excited to share with you my very first true crime story time. Is that what I should call this series? True crime story time? Or, matter of fact, hold on. I do have, there may or may not be coffee in this cup. Just saying. Okay, but yeah, I don't know what I'm gonna call this, but I'm definitely going to do more videos like this. So again, like I said, if you are into true crime, then you have found you a new YouTube channel to tune into. All right, so anyway, let's get to the really good juicy stuff, okay? So this story took place in England back in 1931. I know, very long time ago this happened. But this is the story of Julia Wallace. She was married to Mr. William Herbert Wallace. Now, this happened back in 1931, like I said, and at the time, Mr. Wallace, he was 52 years old, and he worked as an insurance salesman, okay? So I guess in his free time, as a hobby, he would play chess. And so he was a member of the local chess club. They would have chess club meetings at a cafe not far from his home. So on January 19th, 1931, a phone call comes in at the cafe where the chess club meetings are held. And the chess club captain, Mr. Samuel Beatty, he picks up the phone. Hello. And he, on the other end, it's like a roughly voicemail, and they ask to speak to Mr. Wallace. And so Mr. Beatty informs the caller that Mr. Wallace isn't there. And so the caller says that their name is R.M. Qualtrough, and that he would like to meet up with Mr. Wallace about an insurance business. Now, mind you, I said that Mr. Wallace is an insurance salesman. And so he tells Mr. Beatty to tell Mr. Wallace, excuse me, to meet him at 25 Menlove Garden East at 7:30. And so Mr. Beatty takes the message, and then shortly thereafter, Mr. Wallace arrives at the cafe, and Mr. Beatty gives him the message about the phone call to meet a Mr. Qualtrough the next day at 7:30, and he gives him the address. Now, 25 Menlove Garden East, very important. Keep that address in mind. So during this time, it's said that, excuse me, I think I'm getting cold. During this time, it said that it was kind of like in the Depression era there in Britain. So the fact that Mr. Wallace got this phone call in regards to an insurance business meeting, he definitely was going to take that person up on the offer of meeting because it could have possibly meant an insurance commission for him. So the following day, which is January 20th, 1931, Mr. Wallace heads out at 7:06 to the tram. And the tram is like a trolley car service. So at 7:06, he leaves his home, which is 29 Wolverton Street, that he shares with his wife, Julia Wallace, and he goes on the tram. And so while he's on the tram, he lets the conductor and the ticket inspector, he says to them that, I have to go to 25 Menlove Garden East, and, I'm new here. I don't know where that is. Could you please let me know when I should get off, when that stop should be? And so it's kind of stated almost to the point, like, it's like he's going on and on and on, like he's kind of irritated about it and he's kind of annoyed, but is it because he doesn't know where this address is? Is it because it's unfamiliar territory to him? And so it's like he's going on and on and on, badgering them about letting him know when he should get off, when should his next stop be to get off to go to this 25 Menlove Garden East. So the conductor lets Mr. Wallace know, like, okay, I think you should get off here. So Mr. Wallace gets off the tram, and it's stated that he stopped like a dozen people. What? Why are we stopping a dozen people about 25 Menlove Garden East? Like, he is like really on to people trying to find this address, which, I mean, I guess again, it probably isn't too weird because it's a commission involved possibly, and like I said, they were kind of going through a depression era during that time, so maybe he just really wanted to see this meeting go through positively. So he's asking people on the street, do you know where 25 Menlove Garden East is? I guess he's asking them, do you know a Mr. Qualtrough? Like, he's asking around and around and around for the address and Mr. Qualtrough. And so it seems like he's having no luck because no one's heard of this address and no one has heard of a Mr. Qualtrough. And so he comes across back then they had the phone booths and they had like the phone directories. If you were like younger than, like, maybe if you're like even younger than 20, you probably don't even know what a phone book is, but yeah, back in the day they had a phone book with all the people in your area with their address and their phone number, and you could just look through the phone book alphabetical order for whoever it is you're looking for. So Mr. Wallace is looking through the phone directory, and I guess he's trying to find Mr. Qualtrough. To no avail, he can't find him. And so he comes across this police officer, and so he tells the police officer the long story about how he got the phone call at the chess club to meet a Mr. Qualtrough at 7:30 about insurance business. And so the policeman, no help to him. So the policeman basically couldn't help him. And so at this point, I guess Mr. Wallace is getting really annoyed, which again is understandable because you get this phone call about an insurance business meeting and you can't find the address and you can't find the person. I get it. So he sees, like, I guess the post office, which their post office was open that late. But anyway, so he goes to the post office, and I guess the people at the post office like try to help him out. And I guess they try to see if like anybody nearby in the area, if there's a family in the area with the name Qualtrough. And so there was nobody within that area with that name. So I guess at this point, Mr. Wallace is like, look, I am sick and tired of going on this wild egg goose hunt chase for this 25 Menlove Garden East. I'm tired of looking for Mr. Qualtrough. So I guess at this point, Mr. Wallace was like, he chucked up deuces and he's like, I'm out of here. So Mr. Wallace gets back on the tram and he heads back home to his address of 29 Wolverton Street that he stays with his wife, Mrs. Wallace. So Mr. Wallace gets off the tram roughly about 8 o'clock. And so he's at his front door and he's seen by his next door neighbors. Now, his next door neighbors is John and Florence Johnston. And so they see Mr. Wallace, and he looks over to them and he's like, I'm having trouble trying to open up my front door and my back door. They're locked. Have you heard anything strange tonight? And so the Johnsons, they're like, well, no, we haven't heard anything strange. And so the Johnsons, I guess, being good neighbors, they follow Mr. Wallace, excuse me, to the rear of his home. And so Mr. Wallace, he goes to the back door and he turns the knob, and what do you know? It opens. The door opens. So Mr. Wallace grabs the lamp and he walks inside his home. And then a couple of minutes later, he comes out. He says to the Johnsons, you must come and see. She's been killed. So at this point, I'm like, bloody murder. No, that's not what they said. That's what I'm saying. There's been a murder, right? So they all go inside the home, and in the front room, in front of the gas fire, is Mrs. Wallace. There lies Julia Wallace's body in front of the gas fire, right? And so there's like blood splattered up against the wall, and it appears that like Mrs. Wallace has been severely beaten. And so Mr. Wallace, he goes, they finished her. Look at her brains. I'm sorry, what? And so at this point, Mr. Johnson, he's like, this is too much. We got to get out of here. We got to call the police. We got to call the doctor. We got to get out of here, right? And so everyone, they leave out the house, and probably like roughly 25 minutes later, the first set of officers, they arrive on scene. And so of course they like scope out the area, and nothing really seems to be out of place. I mean, the bedroom seems to have been rifled through a little bit, but other than that, nothing really seems to be eye-catching or out of place, right? And so they do inspect like the bathroom and the drains, and it doesn't seem like anything like the drains in the kitchen or anything have been used that evening. And so they do, however, mention that the cleaner of Mr. and Mrs. Wallace stated that the like the fire poker was missing and a metal rod was missing, okay? And Mr. Wallace tells police that in a locked cupboard in a tin can, he had 4 pounds, which I think equates to like $300. He had 4 pounds locked away, and that is missing. So other than the fire poker missing and the Mr. Wallace 4 pounds, which was his insurance commission money that he would keep in there, those were the only things that were missing, right? And so they take Mr. Wallace to the kitchen area. Now, in the kitchen, on top of the table, is Mrs. Wallace's purse. And inside her purse, she had money inside the purse. And so it's like, well, is this a robbery? Because a few months ago, they did have like robberies in the area. So it's like, if this is a robbery, why did they only take Mr. Wallace money, insurance commission money, and why didn't they also take the money that was visibly in Mrs. Wallace's purse? Right? So, mind you, hold on, let me take some. It's so good. Mind you, back in 1919, this happened in 1931. Back in 1919, there was like a major strike, a major layoff, right? And so within the police department, there were like a lot of positions that had been let go. And so they had people doing like two positions in one. So a lot of people were fulfilling more than one position that they wasn't even qualified for, and that they probably didn't even have the experience of doing. So keep that in mind, okay? So they're doing their investigation. They're looking at around the premises, and then they also have Mr. Wallace in the kitchen. So the two officers arrive on scene, and then they have, are you ready for this? Like, when I saw this, I was like, Wait. They had what? Okay. So they had like the pressman from the Liverpool Daily Post. Okay. So he's the pressman and he's working as a police photographer. Okay. Then they had like, I guess, a professor from the university. Granted, he worked in like the medicine, I think he worked in the forensic medicine department. He was serving as the police forensic expert. Okay. So they had a professor also working as the forensic expert. And then they had the pressman from the Daily Post also working as the police photographer. Okay. This investigation is off to a great start. Okay. So, excuse me. Now, back then, it was said that they would use like rigor mortis in the dead body to like get an identification of the time of death, but that was so outdated. Outdated. However, that is what the forensic expert used. He used the rigor mortis as a way to identify the time of death of Julia. And so he says that the time of death was at 8 p.m. Now, Mr. Wallace, well, Mr. Wallace arrived at 8:45. And so this happened 45, the time of death happened 45 minutes before Mr. Wallace arrives home. So that's what they're saying. They're saying Julia died at 8 p.m., right? And so Mr. Wallace is now in the kitchen area and they do their questioning of Mr. Wallace. And so, excuse me, Mr. Wallace gives his statement. He tells them, you know, what happened the previous evening, the night before, where the phone call came in at the chess club for him to meet a Mr. Qualtrough and at this 25 Midlove Garden East address, right? And so Mr. Wallace tells him that, you know, I went out there and I was unlucky. I couldn't find Mr. Qualtrough nor the address. And so I headed back home. And then, you know, the circumstances of events of what happened, right? And so at that time, they're like, okay, well, we need you to come down to the station and we need you to give us a more formal statement, right? And so that's pretty much that. Now, of course, over the course of the next few days, the police are still doing their investigation in Hun T. The things they find out, okay? Let me tell you. For one, they look into, you know, this phone call from the Mr. Qualtrough that was received at the local cafe where the chess club meetings are held. Now, the switchboard operator at the time, they had switchboard operators, you know, the person who when they want to connect the call. So anyway, the switchboard operator, you know, I guess she traces, you know, the call, which is so interesting that they were able to still, like, how long has the ability to trace calls been into effect? Because it's so cool that back in 1931, they were able to identify where the call came from. Well, okay, so let me tell you. So the call came 400 yards away. So the phone call came from a phone booth that was only 400 yards away from where Mr. and Mrs. Wallace lived. 400 yards away. And on top of that, it wasn't far from where he caught the tram. Not far from where he caught the tram, 400 yards away from where he lived. Interesting, okay? So that's the first interesting bit of information that the police come across, right? And so, excuse me. And so at this point, I'm like, okay, how do you explain that, Mr. Wallace? Right? And so, but then also, it's kind of hard for them to really think that Mr. Wallace did it because the time of death is 8 o'clock. Mr. Wallace got there at 8:45, which means all that time prior to that, he was over looking for the 25 Men Love Garden, East address. So it's like, but could he have possibly made the phone call before he left? So right now, the police, is giving Mr. Wallace the side eye. They're giving him the side eye, right? So that's the first interesting bit. Now, mind you, that I told you that Mr. Wallace kept making this big to-do to the conductor and to the ticket inspector about not knowing where this 25 Men Love Garden East address is, right? Because he told them that he's new to the area. He's basically saying he never heard of that address. Well, wow. Come to find out, Mr. Wallace has a friend that lives in the area. Yes, right? And his friend, Mr. Crew, I believe is his name, tells police, like, well, of course Mr. Wallace is familiar with this area. He's an insurance businessman. That's part of his job. He travels around. He goes to different places to have these meetings. And not only that, I don't live too far from the area, and he's come to my house several of occasions. Really? What do you have to say for yourself, Mr. Wallace? So I'm like, so now as I'm reading about this story, I'm like, oh yeah, the husband for sure did it, right? Like, the phone call came 400 yards away from where they live. Not only that, shortly thereafter the call, Mr. Wallace appears at the cafe for the chess club meeting. Then he makes this big to-do like he's never heard of this 25 Men Love Garden East address, and then comes to find out he has a friend that lives nearby in the area, and the friend says of course he should be familiar with the area. But then this happens. 25 Men Love Garden East, guess what? Doesn't even exist. The address doesn't even exist. There's a 25 Men's Love Garden North, there's a South, there's a West, there is no East. The address doesn't even exist. So, like, is Mr. Wallace fronting? Is he putting on? Did he really not know that that address didn't exist? Or did he really believe that the address did exist, right? So, like, the police, they're getting all of this information. They're like, wait, hold on, okay? So they go to Mr. Wallace, and of course they present this information to him. They're like, well, the phone call happened only 400 yards away. You say you don't know about this 25 Men Love Garden East, but then we talked to your friend, Mr. Crew, and Mr. Crew says, of course you're familiar with the area. What do you have to say for yourself, Mr. Wallace? And so Mr. Wallace goes, oh yeah, well, I realized that I was really on Green Lane, which is the area where his friend lives. And so I decided to, call up my friend. So he calls up Mr. Crew, and Mr. Crew doesn't pick up. And so since he didn't pick up, because once I realized I was in the area and I thought maybe I'll go see my friend, and since my friend didn't pick up the phone, then I proceeded to go and continue looking on for this 25 Men's Love Garden East. I didn't realize what area I was in at first. Really? Did you really not realize what area you were in? So now at this point, I got the one eyebrow up, one eyebrow down. I can't do that look. I wish I could do that. I can't do that look. But like right now, Mr. William Herbert Wallace is definitely getting the side eye at this point. And the police feel the same way. So they're like, you know what? Charge him. So they charged Mr. Wallace with the murder of his wife, Julia Wallace, right? So Mr. Wallace, he goes on trial, and he goes on trial in April of 1931. And so the verdict comes back guilty. They find Mr. Wallace guilty of murdering his wife, Julia. Now, he was set to be hung in May of 1931. Now, he appealed his case, so of course that was held off with him being hung. And so he appeals his case, and he goes to the Court of Appeals, and they actually threw out the guilty verdict. And so Mr. Wallace walked out the courthouse a free man. Okay, so essentially they then found him not guilty. Now, there are some really, really interesting like theories concerning this case. And oh my gosh. Okay, so here's one thing. So I told you how Mr. Wallace put on the front that he didn't know where the 25 Men Love Garden East address is. I told you that, right? Well, here comes another bit of information that is so good, okay? Come to find out that during the course of the investigation, Mr. Wallace told police that he had a suspect in mind, and he thought that it could possibly be a previous coworker of his that he used to work with. Mr. Wallace told police about a Richard Perry, right? And so Richard Perry used to work with Mr. Wallace at the insurance company because Mr. Wallace used to work for Prudential. And so it's said that Perry used to work with Mr. Wallace at the insurance company. And so Mr. Wallace had given police Mr. Perry's name, thinking that possibly he could have been a suspect. Because what Mr. Wallace said is that his wife basically would never open up the door for a stranger. Like she wouldn't do that. So she would only open up the door for someone that she knew. And I don't know why, but Mr. Wallace felt that maybe Perry could be a possible suspect. Now, here's the thing about Mr. Perry, his previous coworker. Mr. Perry was known to call and sort of like do prank calls and disguise his voice and do different voices. Now, remember I told you that the phone call that came in at the cafe where the chess club meeting was, that the chess club captain, Mr. Beatty, said that the person had like a gruffly sound voice, right? So with Perry being known to do phone calls disguising his voice, doing different voices, it's possible that could it have been Mr. Perry. And then also Mr. Wallace said that Perry had been over to their house on several occasions. So it's like his wife Julia would have felt very comfortable with letting Mr. Perry inside of the house. So it gets so good with this Perry guy, let me tell you, right? Okay. So apparently, Mr. Perry, right, visited that at like 1 a.m. the next morning after the murder, that Perry went to the Atkinson's garage where a Mr. Parks worked at. And so Mr. Parks said that, he was scared of Perry. And so Perry comes to him with his car and tells him to hose down his car. Okay. And so Parks finds inside of Perry's car a bloody glove where a Mr. Parks worked at, right? And so Mr. Parks states that he was kind of like scared and intimidated by Perry. So I guess Perry was like this big bad guy. I think they did say that he had committed like a few crimes. He was known for committing a few crimes in the area. So I guess he had like this very scary, macho, intimidating personality. And so he arrives at the Atkinson's garage. It's like an all-night 24-hour, I guess, open garage. And so Perry arrives there and he tells Parks, to wash down his car. And so Parks opens up, the car, and he sees a bloody glove. And so Perry says something to the effect of, if the police got a hold of that, I'll be finished. Like something to that effect, right? And then Perry tells Parks that he got rid of an iron fire poker. He threw it down a drain. Mind you, the cleaner for the Wallaces said that the iron fire poker was missing. and a metal rod, right? Right. So now you're thinking, oh, could it have been Perry? Could it have been this Perry guy that did it, right? And so this information didn't come out about Perry until 1981. And so, of course, they asked Mr. Parks, like, well, why are you just now coming out with this information? He waited a year after Perry had died. Perry died in 1980. Mr. Parks didn't say this information until 1981 because basically he said he was scared of Perry, right? And so it's like, okay, well, did Perry do it? But then it gets even better. So it gets even better because during the investigation, right, they asked Mr. Wallace, once he got off the tram, did he come straight home? And Mr. Wallace tells the police, yes, he came straight home once he got off the tram. Well, there's a woman by the name of Lillian Hall that I guess lives in the area. She told police that she saw Mr. Wallace around 8:35, not far from Wolverton Street where he lives. She saw him on Richmond Road talking to a tall, slender man. But Mr. Wallace didn't tell police that he stopped to talk to anyone, right? So that's another, theory like, well, did Mr. Wallace have an accomplice? Who is this man that he was talking to? Or could it have been this Perry guy? Why did he have a bloody glove? And what is with this, like, him getting rid of this iron, like, fire poker? Like, what? Right? So that blowing my mind at this point because I'm like, who the hell killed Julia? Who did it? I have no idea at this point who did it. But then also there's a theory of like, okay, did Mr. Wallace do it? Because the phone call was only 400 yards away from where he lived. And the phone call happened shortly after he arrived. So did he kill his wife and then head to the chess club? But then it's like, okay, did he make the phone call, go to the chess club, and then go back home and kill his wife? But then they're saying that he wouldn't have had that much time to clean up in between killing his wife and then heading to catch the tram at 7:06 because they said like it would have been such a small window of opportunity because people reported seeing Julia between 6:30 and 6:45 that evening. So it's like if Mr. Wallace caught the tram at 7:06, that does not give him a lot of time to clean himself off because remember, like blood is splattered all up against the wall. So whoever killed her should have been covered in blood. So the fact that Mr. Wallace had to catch the tram at 7:06, it doesn't really give him that big of a window of opportunity to really clean himself up. But then also, who else could have done it, And it's like, who would have known that he had that insurance money kept in a locked cupboard inside a tin? And it said that the tin like had the top on top of it. It was put back into the cupboard and it was locked back. Who has time to do that when on the table in the kitchen is Mrs. Wallace's purse with money? You know what I mean? Like, it's a lot of who did it? And then, of course, when they're doing the course of an investigation, they want to look into the relationship of, the spouses of the husband and the wife. So it said that Mr. Wallace, he had he was ill from having trouble with his kidneys because during the investigation, they did have another young policeman do the whole, they did the, what do you call it? They did an experiment of their own where they had someone do the what is it that I'm trying to say, reenact. That's what it is. They had another police officer do the reenactment to see if it was possible for Mr. Wallace to really clean himself up and make it to the tram in that short amount of time. But given that Mr. Wallace was 52 years old and given the fact that he had illnesses from dealing with his kidney, it was kind of unlikely that he would be able to really move that fast and maneuver that quickly to clean himself off and make it to the tram. And mind you, when I said that when the police officers arrived on scene, they did check like the drains at the house and that they seemed to be dry. Like there was nothing there, right? So that's really interesting. It's like, well, who could have done it? So then it said that like, so Mr. Perry, he had suffered from illnesses every now and then from his kidneys. But then they also said that like the Wallace's marriage was kind of like blah. You know, like they said that Mrs. Wallace was kind of peculiar, so they kind of basically saying that she's weird. And excuse me, they're saying that the Wallace's marriage like pretty much had like no kind of feeling. Like there was nothing there. So then that makes police think like, okay, so this guy that Mr. Wallace was seen talking to at 8:35 that he didn't tell police officers about, was that his accomplice? Did he hire someone to kill his wife because he was just like over it? Like what could it be? Then there's also this about the chess club, because remember I told you that Mr. Wallace, I guess as a hobby, he would go to the chess club for the meetings. Now, they do say that the chess club, they would have up on the board, they would have all the different times that they would meet and who's playing. So anyone coming into the cafe could have seen Mr. Wallace's name on the schedule. However, why would they wait until the next day, January 20th, to kill Julia when they could have killed her on the 19th, being the fact that Mr. Wallace was at the chess club? But then they say you really had no idea when Mr. Wallace would show up at the chess club because he wasn't a frequent player at the chess club. Now, this happened in January. They hadn't seen Mr. Wallace since November. Okay? So, if someone was planning to kill Julia, for one, why? But for two, you never really knew when Mr. Wallace was going to show up at the chess club because they hadn't seen him since November. So, how did they know, in fact, that he was going to show up that night in January? And if he was already there on the 19th, if they wanted to kill her, why not kill her while he was already out the house? Like, why wait until the next day to find a reason to get him out the house when you already had him out the house on the 19th, you know? Then there are theories that, okay, we know Julia wouldn't have opened up the door for a stranger, so it had to be someone she knew. Some people even suggested that maybe it was the next door neighbor, the Johnsons, and that maybe Mr. Johnson had a hand in Julia's murder. Now, it's said that many years after the murders that Mr. Johnson, he was living in an old people home, and that he told a friend that he in fact was the one that killed Julia because he thought that she had went with Mr. Wallace to the 25 Menlove Garden East address, so he was expecting no one to be home because he wanted to rob the home. Now, also, while Mr. Johnson was telling that, he's also was suffering from dementia. Like, he was senile and he was suffering from dementia. So chances of that being true are not happening, right? I don't think the Johnsons had anything to do with it at all. Okay, so that is basically the murder mystery of Julia Wallace. So who do you think killed Julia? Do you think Mr. Wallace did it? Do you think his ex-co-worker, Mr. Perry, did it? Like, when I read and I learned about this story, I was like, oh my gosh. Because straight off the bat, I was thinking like, okay, well, straight off the bat, when I heard about it, and I read it, and I'm like, okay, Mr. Wallace gets this phone call to have this business meeting. Initially, my first thought was, okay, they wanted him out the house so they could do away with the wife. Immediately, that's what I thought. But then the more I read about it and the more circumstances of events about the call being 400 yards away, about Mr. Wallace pretending not to know this 25 Men's Love Garden area, but he really did know it. It's like, then it sort of changed my thoughts to like, well, did he do it? And then you hear about Mr. Perry going to the all-night garage, getting his car hosed down, and Mr. Park finding the bloody glove, and then Mr. Perry telling him that he got rid of an iron fire poker rod. It's like, what? But yeah, so that is my true crime story of the killing of Julia Wallace. Please, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. Make sure you subscribe to my channel because like I said, I have a ton more of these videos coming for you. And leave a comment below. Who do you think killed Julia Wallace? And if you have a suggestion of a true crime story that you want me to look into and do a video about, please, 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 I am open to suggestions. Let me know. And I hope you have a beautiful rest of your day or night whenever you're watching this. And I will catch you on my very next video. Bye.